Good afternoon, everybody from Midtown Toronto on Wednesday, February 24th. I'm just watching the participants, the room or so-called waiting room fill up. So I'm just going to move slowly so that everyone can move from the waiting room, which is an interesting term, to the conference room, let's call it for today. Just wait a couple of seconds. It looks, and judging by the number of participants, we have a very nice audience this afternoon for our discussion with Dr. Susan Papp. Everybody, I'm Robert Austin from the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, University of Toronto. I'm delighted with this session. I'm here just to say a few words about the series we're running this term, and then to hand over to my dear friend Andras Kazakamp, also from the University of Toronto. But just as a reminder, we started off in the fall with a conference to look at the centenary of the Treaty of Trianon. And that brought together some really top academics from the United States and Canada for a kind of more historical panel, with some aspects of contemporary issues brought in. And then we had a second part of the conference, which was organized by Dr. Susan Papp, which I mentioned last week, for those of you who were there, brought in a number of, I called them new voices. And Dr. Papp had brought largely people who had experience from living in the countries that ended up outside of Hungary after the Treaty of Trianon. And I have to say, the feedback from that event was really tremendous. And we were particularly praised by bringing in these new voices. And out of that event, we decided we would continue these conversations with some reference to the Treaty of Trianon, because it was the centenary last year, but also to also introduce some new topics. So last week we hosted Laszlo Gummery from Indiana University in Bloomington. Laszlo is an old friend of the center and an old friend of the Munk School, in fact, and he gave an absolutely chilling talk about events in Hungary, primarily focused around the Second World War, but particularly involving the Aerocross takeover in the fall of 1944. And this is an anticipation of a new book that he's got coming out with Indiana University Press, and I think that's probably due out next year. And this talk today, which I'll say a bit more about in a second, by Dr. Papp, is part of the series. But the one thing I want to flag is just a week Friday, which will be March 5th, as part of the same series. We're hosting Dr. Miklos Zeidler, who's a historian in Hungary, and he's, with reference to Treaty of Trianon, he's going to be presenting on Hungary's foreign policy between the two world wars. So that's March 5th at 10 a.m., but many of you are already on the newsletter, so you're aware of that. And then we've got a couple of other guests coming in April, and we'll continue to try to bring new research and new voices that are relevant to the history of Hungary and more generally the history of Central Europe. So today, as I said, Dr. Susan Papp is with us. I'm handing over to Andras Kazakamp. Just a few words about him. He's an old friend. We both graduated from University of Toronto, so did Susan. Andras with his MA, and Andras, we almost crossed paths. I still figured out that we were kind of a year apart, but Andras is a professor of history here at the University of Toronto. He's also the chair of Estonian Studies, and he's also an important member of the Center for European, Russian, Eurasian Studies, and he's in the same building as me. Andras, you know, it's been a while. We saw each other on bikes the other day, or seems like the other day, but I'm looking forward to catching up. It was special for me to ask Andras to introduce Dr. Papp because he was closest to the research, and he was on Susan's committee, so it made a lot of sense for him to play the role that I sometimes play. So Andras, over to you. Susan, looking forward to the talk, and I'll catch everybody. If not sooner, I'll see you on March 5th. Thank you very much, everybody. Andras.
Okay, thank you, Rob, for that kind introduction. As you already said, I'm the chair of Estonian Studies, and for most of our viewers, I hope you all know that Estonian and Hungarian are kindred languages in the same Finno-Ugric language family. So that's also one reason I'm connected to things Hungarian, besides from the fact that I research 20th century political history, just like Dr. Susan Papp, who I had the privilege of supervising for her PhD dissertation, which was completed here a couple of years ago in Toronto, and which will form the basis of her talk today. I think it's an exciting theme because there's very little research published on which is bridging sort of three eras: the interwar era, the Second World War, the Nazi occupation, and the early communist period or post-war period as well. And that transition and how these various figures in the film industry and in Hungarian politics were able to transition through this. Some survived well, others not. Susan digs into the reasons for this and brings some clarity to the issue. And of course, why Hungary in film? I suppose most of you who've tuned in here are also well aware that Hungary was sort of a world leader in the film industry in the first half of the 20th century. So the film industry was very significant in Hungary. And of course, a lot of great Hungarians in the film industry also made a mark in Hollywood later as well. Now, you've seen Susan's bio, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. Just to reiterate that she's an award-winning broadcaster and filmmaker. She's written several chapters and even books. She's very active in the Canadian-Hungarian community, and I'm sure that many in the audience today are very familiar with her activities. So it's a great pleasure to host her, and I will be then moderating the discussion afterwards. And Susan has said that she will speak for somewhere between half an hour and 3/4 of an hour, which should leave us with at least half an hour of discussion time afterwards. So for those of you who have questions, then please type them into the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, and I will read those questions and pose them to Susan later. So sit back and enjoy Susan's presentation.
Thank you.
Over to you, Susan.
Thank you, Andres. Thank you so much for your kind introduction. I am going to get the PowerPoint presentation started, and I want to thank everyone who is participating in today's discussion. This dissertation represents 7 years of work through field work and countless hours of reviewing original sources in 11 archives in Canada, the United States, and Hungary, as well as generating ideas, writing, rewriting, and soliciting thoughtful feedback from my trusted committee. I was further able to hone my skills as a historian and writer. I wish to acknowledge all those who helped me on this journey, my very supportive advisor, Professor Andres Kazakamp, and members of my committee, Professor Piotr Robel, Julie MacArthur, Professor Attila Pók, and Thomas Lahusen, Director of Hungarian Studies, Robert Austin, and Professor Levente Diósady. My dissertation examines how the successive governments in Hungary politicized and shaped the film industry to do their bidding, and how filmmakers, actors, and actresses reacted to those political pressures. My challenge today will be to provide a condensed version of a dissertation that consists of 8 chapters and is nearly 300 pages in length. I will provide only the most important points in the 3 sections. In addition, I will provide examples of how actors and actresses were affected by the ongoing changes in the industry to provide a human face to the historical events. My first section is called Setting the Stage. Cinema became, as Professor Kazakamp just mentioned, a preeminent form of popular culture during the first half of the 20th century in both Europe and North America. From the beginning of the invention of the new film technology, generations of talented filmmakers have originated from Hungary. A large percentage of filmmakers were Hungarian Jews who were immersed in the language and culture of the country. Hungarian audiences expressed their appreciation and enthusiasm for the art form to such a degree that by 1914, 110 permanent cinemas were operating in Budapest. By 1918, 15 professional Hungarian film directors were making a significant number of films. 2 in particular became famous internationally, Sándor Korda, later to be known as Sir Alexander Korda, who built one of the first studios in Hungary, Corvin Studios in Budapest, and Mihai Kertész, or Michael Curtis, as he later became known, who later became director of Casablanca in Hollywood, in addition to almost 100 films there. The prodigious growth of the Hungarian film industry coincided with the golden age of the millennium. It was a time of a self-confident liberal government, the industrialization of parts of the country, the building of Budapest, as well as an unprecedented freedom for capitalists, as well as cultural and the artistic community. Starting in the mid-19th century, Jews had been given increasingly legal freedoms to move, to settle in cities, and own land. As a result, they came to Hungary in search of greater opportunities and education. This is a poster of the film version of a novel by Ferenc Molnár, The Boys of Paul Street.
Sorry, this is AV support here. Susan, we're not seeing your slides. Can you please share them?
Oh, that's a problem. Okay. Sorry, I don't know. 3, and here we go. And where is share? This is wonderful. Okay. Adam, can you help me find where is the share screen button?
So yeah, so just to bring your Zoom window back up to the front, and then the green share screen button at the very center of bottom toolbar.
Okay, just a second. One more moment. My apologies. Here we go. Okay, share screen. And okay, are we sharing the screen now?
Yeah, we're good.
Good, Adam. Thank you. All right. All right. So there was the poster of Molnár Ferenc, Boys of Paul Street. I think the one picture that you missed was Alexander Korda. Shall we go on? Thank you for bringing that to my attention, Adam. This openness and acceptance of newcomers changed radically with the upheaval resulting from the First World War and the dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. A series of brief revolutions, including the Hungarian Soviet Republic, were followed by Red Terror. Even during the short, nearly 6-month reign of power, the regime of Béla Kun recognized the powerful impact of the industry on the masses and nationalized film. During that period, 31 films, mainly propaganda films, were produced. This is a film called The Emperor's Soldiers. In the midst of all the chaos following World War I, some of the best and brightest filmmakers left the country. Section 2, moving right along, is the interwar era and the exclusionary tactics in film. The interwar conservative government of Regent Miklos Horthy set out to mold the film industry to suit its ideals and ideas, while at the same time seeking to limit the number of Jews in the professions. Following 1920, new narratives of Hungarian history served to mark the break with the liberal past and to create a new reality in the political and intellectual life of the country. The propaganda forces of the Horthy government blamed the regime of Béla Kun for the disaster of the Treaty of Trianon. During the interwar years, Bolshevism became the central enemy, reflected in every aspect of life in the country, including newspapers, books, media, theater, and film. While the crash of 1929 caused some studios to fail, by the early 1930s, the film industry started once again to produce films. The introduction of synchronized sound for films, also known as the talkies, was a turning point of technology. causing even higher consumer demands for films. Romantic comedies such as The Dream Car, whose poster you see right here, and the next one, Magalessa Férjem, You Will Be My Husband, were the most popular genre films of the era. Theater tickets were relatively inexpensive, and people sought to escape from the stark realities and tragedies of everyday life. One of the first themes of this presentation is to investigate the conflicted political forces that brought about the creation of the Theater and Film Arts Chamber in 1938. The chambers were a series of professional boards that governed membership in professional societies such as lawyers, physicians, engineers, journalists, and those involved in the film industry. Members of these professions had to be registered with their respective chamber in order to be able to work in their chosen field. This dissertation also examines the growth of anti-Semitism during the interwar years, a force that is critical to understand in historical context as it seeped into the film industry. As defined in my work, a specific type of homegrown, conflicted, or selective anti-Semitism developed in Hungary. Conflicted anti-Semitism refers not to whether there should be anti-Semitic legislation, but how and to what degree the legislation should be implemented. The anti-Jewish chamber system created in Germany in 1933 had the effect of excluding all Jews by 1935. My dissertation examines why the chamber system in Hungary, although patterned on the German system, eventually became ineffective. The first Jewish law of 1938 specified that the Theater and Film Arts Chamber and all the chambers established by that law should limit Jewish membership to 20%. 1 year later, the second Jewish law came in May 1939. The more draconian second Jewish law redefined Jews by race instead of religion, following the Nazi model, and further restricted the number of Jews who could participate in the chambers to 6%. I present an analysis of the 55-page előadói tervezet planned presentation that demonstrates that the government sought control over film and aimed to force Jews out of the industry, but didn't know quite how to exert the control, other than through convoluted bureaucratic rules. I uncovered this significant document in the War History Archives of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, where I was a fellow in 2015. Conflicted anti-Semitism or selective anti-Semitism is further demonstrated by the actions of the government that repeatedly contradicted previous actions. Just 2 days after the implementation of the first Jewish laws in 1938, charges were laid against the head of the leaders of the Arrow Cross, the equivalent of the Nazi Party in Hungary, for incitement against Jews. Many members of the Arrow Cross were arrested. I found this statement of claim against Ferenc Szálasi, the leader of the Arrow Cross, for his anti-Jewish writings. This document was being drafted while, ironically, just 2 days earlier, the government enacted the first Jewish law, focusing on limiting the number of Jews that were able to work in specific professions. These two actions contradicted themselves. This is Ferenc Szálasi being arrested. One part of the ruling government party was focused on limiting activities of the extremist Arrow Cross and their leaders, while another part was intent on carrying out the demands and placating right-wing organizations with further anti-Jewish legislation. The Horthy regime was characterized by this approach avoidance method involving placating, while often simply stalling and postponing the demands of Nazi Germany in order to accomplish the goal of border revision, while keeping radical right forces in check. Following the enactment of the second Jewish law, a new form had to be completed by applicants who wanted to obtain membership in the Theater and Film Arts Chamber. Again, I found this at the United States Holocaust Museum. Full purpose, the revised form meant that members had to apply under much stricter terms and more invasive questions. Here it is in English. The sole purpose of the admission form was to determine who was Jewish and whose ancestors had been Jewish at any time in the previous 90 years. That's 90 years. In later chapters, more examples of conflicted anti-Semitism are demonstrated. A significant voice, businessman, and media owner, Miklos Kozma, refused to implement regulations surrounding the Jewish laws, saying, quote, "If we were to carry out the expulsions 100%, then a large percentage of the most beautiful and patriotic Hungarian songs could not be performed," end quote. In light of the law, well-loved musicals such as János Vitéz, John the Valiant, would have been expunged from radio programs, as well as such popular patriotic songs as Szép vagy, gyönyörű vagy Magyarország, Hungary, you are lovely, you are beautiful, as both were written by Hungarian Jews. Kozma worked assiduously to inform government ministers about the drastic effects of these laws, and for this, he became a target of the extreme right. The new decrees had a massive impact on the film industry. It lost one of its finest directors, István Székely, who you can see here on the right, as well as some of the most popular actors and actresses. Those who left for the United States included Irene Ágai, she's the wife of Székely and she's on his left, Franziska Gál, Yula Kabush, and Szakál Szőke. Szakál Szőke you probably will remember from The Waiter in Casablanca. That was the role, one of his first roles in the United States. Ardent fans of films were undoubtedly stunned by the revelation that Yula Kabush, one of the most famous Hungarian comedic actors of all time, suddenly left his homeland. The filmography of Kabush was extensive. He was one of the hardest working and most highly sought after actors. Kabush left his homeland reluctantly. He traveled to the United States with his wife and son in 1939. There he had little success in translating his skills. His English was insufficient, and tragically, this once famous actor found himself doing one-night stands in low-paying jobs in New York City. In 1941, he suddenly fell ill and died soon afterwards. He died of a heart attack at the age of 57. It's difficult to estimate the number of ruined careers and lives. Yula Kabush is certainly an example of an outstanding, well-loved actor whose career and life were destroyed by the Jewish laws. Other talented Jewish filmmakers, screenwriters, actors, and actresses continued to work, protected through the Stroman system, or straw man system, where misrepresentation ruled. The Hungarian version of this evasive tactics was known as the Aladár rendszer. Jews on credit lists were substituted with non-Jews. Stakeholders and directors of film companies also resisted implementation of Jewish laws, as they were more concerned with the success of their film companies and realized by shutting out Jewish talent, the quality of the films they produced would inevitably deteriorate. The occupation of Hungary by the German army took place on March 19, 1944. This date marked the end of the work of all Jews still active in the Hungarian film industry. In the tumultuous days that followed, Adolf Eichmann's Special Operations Unit began implementing the final solution in Hungary. Many filmmakers who stayed went into hiding. Those who didn't were deported and killed in concentration camps or drafted into labor battalions and died on the Eastern Front. Béla Gál was one of the finest, most prolific producers and directors during the interwar era. He was killed in Dachau on February 17, 1945. It is unclear from the ITS documents, the tracing documents, when he was deported from Hungary. Moving on to section 3, who survived and how. Originally, my intent was to focus on the interwar era exclusively. However, the examination of the certification committees for actors and actresses post-war also provide insight into the work of the Hungarian Theatre and Film Arts Chamber. Specifically, I looked at the means by which individual actors, actresses situated themselves within their field and how perceived collaborators of the Szálasi regime defended themselves against accusations of being complicit in promoting anti-Semitic rhetoric and propaganda. I examined how the politics of retribution unfolded in the reorganization of the fields of theater and film immediately following the end of the war, and assess how the political atmosphere of the interim government was reflected in the decisions of the certification committees. Established in January 1945, the work of the certification committees lasted for 2 years until 1947. The assigned task of the certification committee was to determine if the applicant was, after the implementation of the first and second Jewish laws, a supporter, promoter, or goals of the members of the Arrow Cross or fascist type party who worked to worsen the situation of those who were deprived of their rights and property. More broadly, my dissertation adds to the scholarship of how the certification system worked in Hungary to smooth the transition and how the entertainment industry was salvaged from the ruins of almost complete devastation to become a working and thriving industry again. This industry was crucial to returning to a sense of normalcy and continuity. The certification of actors and actresses was an essential part of that process. The newly appointed mayor of Budapest, János Csorba, made it a priority to reestablish the entertainment industry in a city where much of the infrastructure had been destroyed. Hungarians were avid theater goers before and during the war. It was only during the siege of Budapest, lasting 50 days until February 13, 1945, that the theaters were completely shut down. Before the siege even ended, Mayor Csorba named 3 individuals to organize the administration and startup of the performances at the Budapest Opera House. As a politician, Csorba understood intuitively that one of the important ways to bring the population of the city out of its siege mentality was through cultural institutions. By February 16, 1945, the Budapest Central Committee had named 11 new directors for each of the theaters of Budapest. Mayor Csorba also issued a special appeal in January to the Hungarian Artist Free Union Film Committee to rebuild the film sector. He requested a report on the working condition of all film production companies, laboratories, theaters. Moreover, he wanted the film companies to document the state of the destruction of the city on film and in still photographs. The Actors Certification Committee was urged to certify actors and actresses who would resurrect the theater and film industry. Hilda Gobi, seen here, cleaning rubble with her bare hands in front of one of the buildings, one of the ruined buildings, one of the many ruined buildings in Budapest. She was the only woman appointed to participate in organizing this monumental task. Gobi described the Actor Certification Committee's barely functional office space. Quote, "With a friend, we noticed a burnt out space above the Hirado Theater, which was empty. We took a broom, threw out the broken glass and other debris through the window and wrote on a sheet of paper, 'The Actors Union is open.' We hung this sign on the gate and I told my friend to sit down next to a banged up table. And only the devil knows how it happened, but the people just started coming. We gave numbers to their identity cards and found out where they lived and what they needed, medicine, food, or a little shelter to live in the National Theater." The first document created by the hastily assembled, this is the cover of her memoirs, and that's where the quote is from. The first document created by the hastily assembled Actors Union was a list dated February 13, the date that marked the end of the siege of Budapest. This document listed 98 of the most famous actors and actresses who were widely known for their anti-fascist resistance. The Actors Union provided these individuals with passes to guarantee their freedom of movement in Budapest. One blank space, number 85, was left for Pál Jávor, one of the most outstanding and popular actors of film and stage. Between 1931 and 44, he starred in 76 Hungarian films. In late 1944, Jávor was arrested by the Gestapo and no one knew his whereabouts and feared the worst. He was found alive, however, and released from prison in 1945. Here he is with one of the classical, one of the most beautiful actors in interwar history, called Katalin Karadi. The Actors Certification Committee began the task of examining individual files on March 1st. It would take 2 more months for the war to end in Europe. The decisions set out by the Certification Committee were divided into 4 main categories. Igazolva, so automatically certified. Megfedés, reprimand, this category was used in instances where the committee determined that the offense was minor in nature. Időleges, 1-2 szezon, for basically a temporary ban. This decision specified the number of months or years for which the individual was banned from work. And the final ban for life, which was the most serious classification and usually meant that the case was redirected to the municipal courts. My dissertation is the first qualitative study examining the original archival files of the Magyar Színészek Szakszervezete Igazoló Bizottsága Actors Certification Committee, and I was able to compare and contrast the methodology used by the film employees through the Film Employees Union that included employees of Hunia, the largest film production house during the interwar year, as well as many other smaller production companies. The difference between the certification processes of the 2 unions was significant and impactful. I wanted to show you the questions that were being asked of the Actors Certification Committee, created in 1945. The questionnaires were highly qualified individuals who were provided with a mandate to root out and expel from the professions those who had sympathized or worked with the extreme right. Initially, this system seemed to be working. Thousands of actors and actresses who were not engaged in political activity during the interwar years were certified expeditiously. The procedure utilized by each union to certify members was very different. The Certification Committee for Actors and Actresses depended on the reputation of the actor in question and the testimony of others. The questions asked were, I find, very simplistic and leading. Which political parties did you belong to is obviously a very open-ended question, but the ones that basically are my favorites are, what newspapers did you read? Which, if you know who's asking the questions, you'd want to shape your answers to make sure that they were pleased with your answers. What theater presentations did you accept roles in? What were your feelings when Germans occupied Hungary? Which to me, again, is such a subjective question that anybody could make up anything to answer that question. And again, you were given an opportunity to talk about your colleagues and say which ones were known Nazi sympathizers. If you couldn't answer the rest, or if you yourself were complicit, then you could always get them involved in the process of tell all kind of question. Did you know or have any dealings with any known Nazi sympathizers? Members of the Film Employees Union, this is the second part, on the other hand, required those seeking certification to complete a thorough 53-question survey of their domestic, economic, social, and political background. The litmus test for the questionnaire was whether, just want to get it up in English. The litmus test for the questionnaire was whether the film employees had benefited from the implementation of the Jewish laws and mainly the confiscation of Jewish property. The members of the Film Employees Union were examined in great detail. Moreover, the neighbors of individuals applying for certification with this union were also requested to put input into this process. The committee directed that an announcement be placed on the building where the applicant resided. The announcement requested that if anyone in the building knew whether the individual applicant had taken part in, quote, fascist or Germanophile activities, end quote, the tenant should report this to the certification committee in writing. This information was to stay in the announcement board for 8 days. After examining the files of both of these major certification committees, I conclude that actors and actresses were given greater leeway and tolerance. Their hearings were held in secrecy. Personal wealth, you will notice there are several questions here on personal wealth. And if your personal wealth jumped in any significant way between 1938, 1939, and 1945, you had somehow acquired an apartment that a Jewish family had been thrown out of, then you were under suspicion for benefiting from those who had been whose rights had been abrogated and whose property had been taken away. According to my research in examining over 50,000 files, approximately 85% of the individuals in the entertainment industry who applied for certification were certified. A smaller percentage, roughly 10% of actors, actresses, and individuals involved in the field of film were not certified, including those who were found to be part of right-wing movements or those who left the country. The documents of the certification committees also shed new light on the intentions of those who applied for certification. They demonstrate that the intention of the majority of actors and actresses were opportunistic and gain-oriented rather than idealistic. The Trial of Ferenskish, former president of the Theatre and Film Arts Chamber, is examined in detail. Kish was bought back from Austria by the Americans to be placed on public trial. He was charged with I have to say this in quotes, sorry. He was charged with, quote, handing over the entire film industry to the mercy of the fascist worldview and condemning actors and actresses to be used as agents of propaganda, end quote. The trial of Kish was widely publicized as, quote, overshadowed by prejudice and the vulgarity of the contemporary press, end quote. The trial lasted 2 days. Kish was the only individual active in the sphere of arts in Hungary to be found guilty of war crimes and to be sentenced to 8 years hard labor. In effect, it was a show trial. Unlike in France, where 2 writers, Robert Brasillach, who you see here, novelist and journalist, and Jean Loucher were executed for, quote, intellectual crimes. More specifically, quote, intelligence with the enemy. Very interesting expression. In Hungary, however, no one in the field of arts was executed for collaborating with the Arrow Cross or the Nazis. The testimony of those actors and actresses called to hearing before the certification committee at times seemed arbitrary and capricious, often laden with misrepresentation. If the background of the actor came under scrutiny, political connections were the key to obtaining certification. Of the more than 300 sound films made during the interwar years, 3 films and 1 stage play were examined for being propaganda productions. The stage play was the Hungarian version of Jud Süß, Süß the Jew, a major anti-Semitic Nazi propaganda film originally supervised by Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's Minister of Propaganda. Yet even in examining those involved with this highly offensive play, the Ártatlanok, the Innocents, the courts were surprisingly lenient on Lajos Kádár, the writer, and Laszlo Gummery, who played a major role in the play. The charges against both men were dropped as they went on to star in major television series in the 1960s in Hungary. The fact that both had political connections in the post-war government appears to have played a major role. Jud Süß was produced by Veit Harlan, one of the leading filmmakers of Joseph Goebbels. Harlan played a starring role as well. He was the only film director of the Third Reich to be charged with crimes against humanity twice. Harlan was acquitted in both cases. In several instances, specific individuals were placed under special scrutiny because of their positions of leadership. The files of Ferenc Lor offer such an example. Lor was an electrical engineer who worked for Hunia beginning in 1930. He was appointed director of technical engineering in 1942. Based on his file, Lor was passionate about learning and perfecting the technical aspects of sound within the film industry. His first book, Film Salagutya, The Development of Celluloid, was published in 1942. In 1944, Lor was named to a 5-member committee appointed by the Szálasi regime to direct work at Hunia. In his testimony at the certification committee hearings, he defended himself and provided several witnesses to demonstrate that during the final days of the war, he postponed and defied orders to dismantle and remove the factory's technical equipment under what he termed the false pretense that equipment be moved to Bad Gastein near Vienna, where, quote, allegedly Hungarian films would be produced again. He also stated that along with another engineer, they sabotaged this request as well as other technical requests from the Aero Cross. The veracity of his statements and actions were upheld by several witnesses. Despite this, Lor was banned to work in the film industry for life. He appealed the decision of the certification committee and provided an 8-page statement of defense. In it, Lor lists 14 former employees of Hunia who would testify as to the veracity of his statements regarding his behavior in the last days of the Szálasi regime. The decision of the certification committee was upheld by the People's Court. Despite the ban, Lor stayed in Hungary. His talents in technical sound and acoustics were so exceptional, however, that in 1951, he was put in charge of designing and overseeing the sound system for the newly built Népstadion, People's Stadium. This is the inside of his books. It really is very technically oriented. After the Communist Party consolidated its hold on the government in May 1949, the regime recruited and rehabilitated famous Hungarian actors from the interwar era, such as Ferenskish, and who you see right here, Antal Páger. Páger was lured back to Hungary from Argentina to resume his acting career, while the regime seemingly ignored the fact that he had been found guilty in absentia by the People's Tribunals in 1945. Páger was encouraged to return despite the fact that he starred in the same films that caused the banishment of others. Ferenskish, the only actor convicted of war crimes, was rehabilitated and returned to the stage. In the 1960s, Kish and Páger were even honored separately with one of the most distinguished awards by the government for their work in film and theater. It was as if the trials of the late 1940s were abrogated and a revised narrative was written for those found guilty post-war to provide legitimacy for the communist regime. The return of Páger to Hungary is important because it underscores how, within less than a decade, the ideological face of the communist regime changed because of the Cold War. This dissertation describes in detail the interconnectedness, relationships, sense of belonging, and career opportunities within the world of acting and cinema. Just as the interwar Horthy regime attempted to politicize the film industry, and in doing so, to mold the film industry to reflect its values, so too the post-war communist government of Hungary also exploited actors and actresses in the film industry in order to provide that government with legitimacy. As intellectual, writer, and dissident Miklós Haraszti wrote, "Freedom is an essential condition of art. Anything that severs art from its anti-authoritarian essence will kill it." The final image I want to leave you with is a poster for Mephisto, a film written and produced by István Szabó in 1981. It is about an actor whose career was promoted by the Nazis, but while doing so, he loses his soul. Another István Szabó film, Taking Sides, is also an example of the complexities of convicting an artist of collaboration, whether he or she was an actor, producer, writer, or music conductor during the war. Finally, this dissertation notably further adds to the research and discussion of how to shape and for what purpose a nation's memory of the war and post-war years. From the end of the Second World War through the mid-1960s, the experience of what went on in the first half of the 20th century in Europe became blurred. In dealing with the Second World War, it almost suited almost everyone to forget about the crimes of their own nation. European nations, both in East and West, willingly subsumed their memories into the freezer of history, as Professor Piotr Robel has so aptly said. From the mid-1960s, a much debated revival of memory has emerged, starting in Germany, then moving to France, Italy, and elsewhere in Europe. In addition, archives previously closed have opened, and a new generation of historians have been examining post-war memory history, bringing fresh perspectives. The question of how to shape and for what purpose a nation's memory in the war years and post-war years is still being formed and framed in Hungary as it is in many European countries. Thank you for your kind attention. I look forward to answering your questions.
Right, thank you, Susan, for an excellent presentation. It's amazing how you managed to bring your whole dissertation and compact it into a very sort of tasty morsel. I think you presented it in an excellent way. We had a little bit of problem with the slides at the beginning, but we got over that immediately. I hope everyone was able to see and hear everything very clearly. But in any case, the presentation went very well. Let me begin myself with, as usual, the chair usually abuses his position to ask a question. And it's one that I've asked you before, but why is Hungary sort of unique? Or in other words, why can we compare Hungary with other Central European countries, such as, for instance, Poland? Was this experience particularly with the certification committees and what happened with the film industry immediately after the Second World War? Was something similar done elsewhere in Central Europe? What does the Hungarian case tell us about sort of a wider experience?
I really appreciate your question. Poland is a very different situation in particular because they because of the division, the partitioning of Poland, because of many different traumas that the Polish nation went through, I think it's very hard to compare. They had a hard time establishing a film industry. It was only during the interwar era that it was in fact established. During World War II, they were, as you know, the resistance fighters were fighting. They found one actor who had changed, taken on a Danube Schwabian type of identity, and he was killed by the resistance. Anyone who became German, who was a Polish actor and became German, he was assassinated by the underground. So in many ways, there was no such thing as complicity or working with the Nazis, as far as the entire government, as we all know, went abroad. They started governments in exile. They fought against Nazi occupation of their country. So in some ways, I think Hungary is unusual because during the Austro-Hungarian Empire times, when it was Kingdom of Hungary, it actually had a very viable film industry, and it accepted Hungarian Jews. And for Hungarian Jews, it was a new industry, a new technology to be able to learn, a new way to become part of the mainstream of Hungarian society, which they sought to build and to become part of this. They saw advancements in education. They were able to continue their education. They were able to buy land. They were able to, they had mobility, and they become part of the mainstream of Hungarian society. And this is why I think they were leaders in adapting Hungarian literature, great books of literature to film. And unfortunately, with the Red Terror and afterwards the White Terror, then the chaos that happened after World War I with the Treaty of Trianon, and so many Hungarian Jews were then partitioned off to various other countries, the Hungarian film industry suffered a great deal. The audiences got much smaller, and so much happened. After World War II, it's important, I think one of the things I couldn't leave out, because I couldn't bring in every aspect of the historical, what happened exactly at the time. Every political party had a seat within the certification committees. No matter how many certification committees there were, every political parties, and there were 5 political parties that all wanted to have a say in who would be certified and who wouldn't. So if you were a leftist leaning party, the Communist Party, for instance, would want to sabotage a former actor from the interwar era who was very right wing. They'd want them out. Or a lawyer who was very right wing, they know right away. But then there were these interfactional parties within the certification committees as to who would win out and who would remain and who wouldn't. So.
Okay, I have a question here from Bruce Rhodes. The Hungarian film Angivera, directed by Paul Gabor, was released in 1978. I saw the film and recall that it was, to a fair degree, an indictment of the contemporary system, in that it portrayed the work of informants making life difficult for Vera, who worked in a hospital and complained about the sanitary conditions there. Now the question, does it surprise you that this film was as critical as it was of the regime at the time? This is a bit past your period, but still you're an expert on Hungarian film.
I'm not surprised at all. I think that there was a whole movement, and John Cunningham writes about this extensively, of filmmakers who were rebellious, filmmakers who could bring issues to the screen. In the 70s, there was a brand new movement of Hungarian filmmakers who wanted to make a difference and who wanted to very subtly bring about, and you saw them obviously much later as well, but I'm not surprised about the opening up, because once after 56, there was, as everyone knows, there was a loosening of the strict Stalinist type of rules, regulations, laws. The secret police's roles were diminished, certainly by the 70s. And things, we had goulash, in Hungary, they had goulash communism, and it was definitely a very different role. So anyhow, I don't know if I've answered it, but it's not my field. And not only that, but I really do think things opened up quite a bit.
Christian Hedrick is curious about your sources. The question is, what kind of sources were most useful to you, since there seems to be few secondary sources? Were there any still extant studio archives available, or was this kind of material distributed across other archives like public city or state archives in Budapest, etc.?
Is an excellent question. Thank you very much for that question. I would like to say this was one of the most challenging topics to take on, because by their own admission, the archives was hit by several times. It was practically destroyed, the National Archives, during World War II, when Hitler basically gave the order, don't leave one stone upon another in Budapest, use Budapest as a battleground. And I went from the Liszt Ferenc Academia to the Budapesti Fővárosi Levéltár. The Budapest archives was the most helpful in gathering up and preserving these certification documents. But I was surprised at how few studies have been done on the certification process. I even found materials in the Hoover Institution archives, an entire file on Ferenskish and his trial and the post-war trials that went on in Hungary. One, obviously, someone who left in '56 created this enormous file of newspaper clippings and all kinds of interviews and fascinating collection, István Madai. The Hungarian Jewish Museum and Archives was very good and helpful. The Library of Congress Film Archives. Of course, I mentioned my fellowship at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. I'm very grateful to my colleagues and friends still there who were very helpful. The Széchenyi, and even noticeably how amazing it was that the New York Public Library for the Performing Arts has a file in it called the Edmund Pauker Papers. Edmund Pauker was an agent who came out in the late 1980s, and he helped Jewish writers and novelists to bring their pieces of literary books, etc., plays to the American screen and American stage. So, and he also helped non-Jews as well. But it was such a vast array of 11 archives, because there's not one central body. And I, of course, have to mention the Hungarian Film Archives, which everyone was very, very helpful. And I just had very many colleagues in the United States and in Budapest who helped. And I hope some of them are listening today and would feel my gratitude for their help. Thank you.
All right, I don't see any other questions at the moment. I would encourage those who still do to write quickly. So let me ask one myself here, that what surprised you most while doing your research? Like, what went against your expectations when you started the project? And was there something that you found that kind of thought was unexpected or surprising for you, that was not something that you thought you would see?
I really want to give maybe one more example of this. There was an amazing one actor who ever said, you know, I've had it, this is too much, we've got to answer too many questions. And he dared criticize. His name was Laszlo Gummery, and he said, while under cross-examination, he said, quote, "Before this political change happened, I was one of the best loved actors of all the regional theaters. No one asked me what my political views were, and it wasn't necessary for me to deal with politics," end quote. He admitted to being a member of the chamber, but never of the Turul. Laszlo Gummery was provided certification. I was surprised that he was given certification, despite the fact that he spoke up so loudly in front of the certification committee and said, "This is enough. This is just too much politics. Forget it. I'm really fed up with being put under the." I think one of the saddest things was Ernő Dohányi, who was head of the Budapest radio orchestra, a very prestigious position, and was conductor of the national orchestra in Hungary, in Budapest. And he simply left in 1945. And of course, someone or somewhere, someone in the certification committee said, oh, but he was accused of playing mostly German music on the radio. Now, if we think about how many German composers and conductors we know, I wasn't surprised by that. But the fact that they banned him for life, they banned his music from Hungary for life. And in actual fact, he went out to the United States and his music became more popular than ever. He made a new life for himself at the at the Florida State University where he taught, and his music, as I said, was allowed to be heard, or was heard, became very popular worldwide, despite the ban in Hungary.
Okay, we have a question from Emoko Sasmari. Hope
Mhm.
I didn't mispronounce the name.
Yes.
Did you come across anything that suggested that in the interwar years, the Hungarian government considered that the film industry could be helpful in obtaining popular support for Hungary through films directed to Western viewers? Other countries used such propaganda. Did Hungary?
Absolutely. Excellent question. Hungary did use such propaganda because Hungary felt that, in actual fact, they had gone through a major trauma of World War II and the Treaty of Trianon, and that no plebiscites were held in many of the territories that were handed over to the successor states, and that 3 million Hungarians were now under foreign rule. And they wanted to bring this political mistake, what they considered a big political mistake, to the attention of the world. And they believe that through showing that Hungarians are civilized, a cultured people with a long history of 1,000 years, that they could make such a change. They could bring that to the attention of the world. I think the question is excellent. How they brought it about, there were a lot of the narrative of World War I was actually, what did they call the enemy? They called the enemy Huns. And in many people's minds, Huns, Hungarians, Germans, it was all the same. It was all under one basket. So there was a great deal of a disinformation about Hungary, the people of Hungary. Where is Bucharest? Where is Budapest? The two were constantly being mixed up. But in actual fact, the injustice of the Treaty of Trianon is still, to this day, reverberates through society and through many, many parts of Hungary, including Hungarian communities that live outside of Hungary's borders. So yes, the Horthy regime tried very much to bring this attention to the world.
Well, I don't see any more questions. So I think a good final question from myself would be, when can we, that is the audience, expect to be able to read in published form your research? I've of course read it many times through, but for the audience members, tell us about your publishing plans, whether they be an article or in a book form. How far have those plans progressed? I mean, I know it's not easy to get a book deal with anybody, so it often takes, fresh PhDs sometimes publish their books 10 years after they've defended their dissertation. But when can we at least, that is the audience, be able to read in book or chapter or article form the results of your research?
I am hoping, what really surprised me was that here you spend so many years creating this academically acceptable. Let's start from the beginning. I've written books before, and once I got back into academia to do my PhD, I realized that I really had to change my writing style. I was much more interested always in the human stories, the interconnectedness, the fact that people were so affected by a lot of these rules and regulations and laws, and to look at the human cost of what had happened. It was particularly moving. As I said, I found 11 lives of producers, directors, and actors and actresses that I followed along in my research who were killed in the Holocaust. There were others who died of hunger, and I know that lots of members of the population of Budapest, living in Budapest at the time of the siege, died of hunger. So to meet these people before the war happened was very moving. And in my mind, somehow, these human stories are what brings truly disastrous historical events to light. It is what makes you understand the Holocaust, World War II. Living through something like that is only through knowing or reading someone's memoir, meeting a person in person. And I felt like I met a lot of those people at the United States Holocaust Museum through the documents that I read. And I met a lot of those people at the film archives and even at the Edmund Pauker papers at the New York Public Library for the Performing Arts. Those people are there in their written record, in their letters, in their biographies. And this is the kind of book I would really be interested in writing, in rewriting my dissertation. Not so much because it is an administrative, historical, sort of a legal history of what happened to actors and actresses, what I've written now. And what I'd really like to do is rewrite it. Unfortunately, that's what's needed, and rewrite it to make it a more personal something which will touch the hearts of people who want to find out about the era, want to find out what it was like to be an actor or an actress in the interwar period, and what it was like to be told, no, you can't act anymore because of how you stood, or the fact that you were a student. Even students at the Film Academy had to go through the certification process. And one of them, mistakenly, before Ferenskish was put on trial, he waved to the director of the film chamber. He waved to him innocently, and someone reported him. And this poor young 17-year-old would never be able to continue on his career path as an actor or actress. And several other young people were affected by this. It's almost like I just do have to feel that I have to end it with maybe a quote from István Deák, most admired historian, Hungarian historian. He compared it to a historical arc that encompassed the era from 1939 until the 1960s. It was a time when institutional lawlessness reigned in Hungary. That is, quote, when innocent citizens were arbitrarily deprived of their civil rights, their property, and often their life, end quote. And it's the examination of the work of the film chamber and the establishment of interwar and 2 specific post-war certification committees. I feel I've given further support to that arc of institutional lawlessness, which is very tragic, but that happened in many countries, in many areas of the world. And it's not, I'm not saying that as a defense of Hungary, but I'm just saying it's a tragic period in Hungarian history.
Thank you, Susan. I think that was a very touching and personal way to approach this, to wrap up what has been a fascinating and very clear and focused presentation. And one way or another, we can look forward to reading your results. It could be, for instance, in a smaller, sort of compact academic article, and then perhaps in a monograph which has more of that human story to it, rather than the sort of academic formalities that are required in writing a PhD, which, as we found out in this experience, that writing a book for the general public and writing for an academic audience requires sort of different set of skills and a different approach. And now you learned that process very well, and now you're going to go back to writing for a general audience, because of course you want the story to get out there to as wide of an audience as possible. I also understand you've done documentary films before. Were you considering perhaps a creative project based on this rather than a writing project, like a film project, documentary perhaps?
I think that's truly a brilliant question, but because the two do go together, but it's very hard to do a documentary about people who aren't around anymore. That's the tragedy of television or of documentary films, that they eat up images. So I would have to find the personal archives of many of these actors and try to put together. I don't think it would be that difficult, but it would take me a number of years to find and put together all these stories, because I do think that they are international stories of, as I said, Yula Kabush and Katalin Kadar, that very beautiful actress who we saw in one of the pictures. She she started a hat shop in New York City, because an actor's talents really are not transferable easily. They have to speak English, they have to know the language, they have to be able to transplant themselves into a country where the language and culture is completely different. And Saka Asuka got along really well without the language skills, because he had an accent that worked, and they would know when we need an accent, a Hungarian Eastern European accent, we'd call him, or Béla Lugosi. But they got put into very specific roles, and never could they break out of those roles. Béla Lugosi was always the vampire, and always the person who had the scary role as someone who is the werewolf. Anyway, I guess what I'm saying is that politics, unfortunately, and like my final quote from Haraszti, said, when you put all kinds of authoritarian mix, art and authority don't mix well. And when you start putting rules and regulations around artists and actors and actresses and film directors and producers, then inevitably bad things happen. So these were some of the things that happened that were really very sad. So.
Okay, I think that pulled everything together very, very nicely. I want to thank Susan and once again for the fascinating research and presentation, and also the members of the audience for being here with us today and posing questions. And I'll also say this session is being recorded, which means that if you have friends or colleagues who missed this, weren't able to attend, they'll be able to watch this at their leisure at some time. So recommend this to people who you might know who would be interested. So at this point, then I also want to thank the technical people, Adam and Daria at the Monk School, and Rob Austin for organizing this. So we look forward to meeting all of you again, hosting you again in the premises of the Monk School rather than here online. So have a good afternoon, everyone, and hope to see you in person someday soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.